For all of you who are here, thank you so much for coming. We are so excited to have you here today. My name is Joy Yamaguchi. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Japanese American National Museum. So on behalf of JANM, I want to thank you for taking the time today to join us for Queer Nikkei Stories, Intergenerational Conversations, which is a collaboration with Okaeri and Visual Communications with support from the Aratani Foundation. I'm going to actually invite Stan Yogi to join me now to tell us a little bit more about that and introduce the program. So hi, Stan. Thank you so much. Take it away.
Okaeri is really delighted to be partnering with the Japanese American National Museum and Visual Communications on this program tonight. So tonight we're going to be listening to and participating in two pairs of conversations between queer identified Japanese Americans of different generations. So the first pair will be June Lagmay and Aya Tasaki. So June was born in Yokohama, and she was a founder and a co-chair of Asian Pacific Lesbians and Gays, which was the first organization in Southern California and perhaps the nation for queer identified Asians and Pacific Islanders. Aya Tasaki was also born in Japan. She is an activist who is currently working with the National Network of Abortion Funds, and she is on the advisory board of Red Canary Song, which is a grassroots organization that is organizing Asian migrant massage and sex workers. So we're going to see a short film about June now, and then Aya and June will be in conversation.
From 16 up to today, and I'm 65, so that's nearly 50 years. I have had more years with my Rita than I have without her. They say either birds of a feather or opposites attract. We were very opposite. I was teacher's pet. I got the good grades. I was the know-it-all. And she was Rita Bandita. She was caught smoking in the girls' room. She was always in detention. And we would pass each other in the hall. It was like, she would look at me with scorn and distaste, and I would do the same. I never pretended that I was going to ever have a boyfriend with my parents. My mom, sadly, because she didn't speak a lot of English and because she was from the old country, she never had an advanced education in Japan, was always after me to have a boyfriend and to get married. And it was difficult because I did not have the actual vocabulary or the language to tell her, Mom, my life is going to be different. I'm going to pursue a career. I believe in social change. In 2008, when Prop 8 was on the horizon, Rita and I said, before the door shut, before the election happened, we've got to take this opportunity and go to the county registrar and get that marriage certificate. And I let a few close cousins know, and those few close cousins told other cousins, who told aunts and uncles. And what was going to be a simple ceremony of signing a document on the registrar's desk came in to, can we come to? When I told my father, Dad, Rita and I are going to sign the marriage certificate, he goes, yeah, that's good. Your mom and I were discriminated against when I tried to marry her in Japan. They wouldn't even let us into the altar of the Catholic Church. We had to get married in the vestibule. And he showed up to the ceremony that we ended up having in our backyard with his dog because he wasn't going to leave the dog at home. That was one of the most moving moments of my life, when my entire family insisted that they show up. They showed up and celebrated and shared a meal and cut the cake and had champagne. And that was like the culmination of my coming out. I have to say my family loved Rita and Rita's family loved me. I have met so many inspiring people during my life who were my role models. You feel responsible to carry that on. You don't want to slip back. You want to keep pushing that envelope. So it's a synergy. It's a synergy. You don't do it by yourself. Everyone pollinates and sparks other people, and it just makes this beautiful, blooming community. Hi, Aya.
Hello, June. It's so good to see you.
So good to see you too.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for joining us. So we have the impossible task of trying to just crunch all of your wisdom into 15 minutes. So let's see if I can do
Not
that.
crunch my wisdom. We're having a conversation, so it's
That's
a
true.
two-way street, and I want to hear your input too. Absolutely. So
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
Great. Well, I think it's pretty clear from the video that we saw that Rita and your relationship has been really, really just foundational to your life in many, many ways. And clearly you both have amazing fashion senses, as we could see from the photos.
Oh no, you like the Nehru jacket, huh?
I liked all of it. The sunglasses, it was just great. But I think I'm just really curious because there's one part of your story where there's, you share about this really heartfelt, amazing thing that happened when you and Rita legally got married, and your whole family just turned out and just really, really celebrated that. And I heard also that when your mother was alive, that, there was sort of, maybe it was clearly spoken or unspoken, but there seemed to have been an expectation that you were going to get married, I'm assuming, to a man, and to have a particular type of life. And so I'm wondering, what was your internal coming out to yourself? Was there ever one, if you had one, or was it just kind of not a big part of your identity until a certain point in your life? Because it does sound like you also had a lot of ambitions of what you wanted to be, what kind of work you wanted to do. So I'm just wondering how that part of your life went.
That's a lot to unpack. So it's true, as I said in the video, that I had like two roads. The road that I was pursuing with dignity for the gay Catholics and APLG for the gay Asians and all the political work that I was doing. And then there was my family. And the two were pretty much separate. Although I do remember I did bring my dad once to an APLG meeting. So I do have that memory. But it really wasn't till the wedding when I was 50, when the family just stormed the gates and just came over to participate in the wedding, that the two roads came together. So that's one of it that I have enjoyed now, the fusing from age 50 on. But if I can go back to my 20-year-old self, I think the energy that was behind me and the love that I had for Rita, it was a very big part of my life, but it wasn't any smaller or bigger than all the other identities that I was going through. Being a lesbian, being Asian, being fighting for a new way in the world, joining in with friends who were Hispanic and doing their cause. So in other words, I felt I had more than one identity or two identities or three identities. And I want to ask you this question later too, the whole bicultural angle too, trying to be whole and legitimate among all the other things that you're trying to do in your life without leaving anything behind. So there in early days there were difficulties. Like I think Rita's dad once asked her, "You're not a dyke, are you?" And she was pretty appalled by that. And I think honestly in her mind she refuted that, because that was a word full of hate and maliciousness. Whereas what we thought and believed that what we had going was something almost pure and spiritual and almost religious, So yeah, people would say nasty things and people would say racial things. And I think the best way we got by that is just trying to outsmart them at their own game and being cleverer than they were. So, but we never felt that what we had was ugly or shameful, but we did know that it was going to take time for the rest of the world to catch up to where we were. So I'm glad that at my advanced age, I think it's really happening. So go ahead. That's all I have to say.
No, I really appreciate that. And, I think this whole thing about the spaces that allow us to be all of us, our wholeness, right, is just such a treasure, and it's really precious. And and I'm reminded of, I think the first time I really felt that for the first time was I'm gonna say it's probably like sometime like 2010 or so, when I was living in New York City, and I was organizing with an organization called the Audre Lorde Project, which is still around, and they're a very radical grassroots queer and trans people of color collective. And we organized the first ever LGBTQ contingent for the May Day March, which, as I'm sure is to really speak out about labor rights, workers' rights, and migrant rights, right? And I remember that we had our contingent. We're surrounded by union folks. We're surrounded by families. We're just surrounded by a multi-generational, multiracial, multilingual crowd. And one of my friends, she identifies as queer, and she's from Nigeria. And she looked over at me and said, Aya, I think this is the first time I feel like my whole self, because it's the first time I'm able to embrace the fact that I am an immigrant in this country, that I am a Black woman in this country, that I am queer, that my parents are workers and have worked their entire lives in I guess what you would call blue collar jobs. And when she said that, it really did strike me that there is such power in being in a space where all of your identities just exist and melt together in this vessel that's your body.
Yes, we're more than one thing, and we have our religious or spiritual aspect or not. Mm-hmm. We have our artistic side. We have our musical side. They are all legitimate, and I admire your perception of that we need to be integrated. We are not just one thing, but if one thing is being looked askance by the rest of society, then we have to push that forward so that all parts of us
I imagine that a lot of the work that you did in I guess especially when you were a student, I imagine that it was creating those spaces, right? Because even if I were to go to a space that's labeled as an Asian queer space, if I feel like any other part of me is not is being negated or it's not being embraced, then I feel like then I have a responsibility to bring that up in the space, so that that space is able to hold the multi identities that everybody is bringing. And I'm wondering, in the beginning of your, I don't know if you would call it activism, but I'm just going to call it activism. But in the beginning of your activist life, what were those spaces like? What were the challenges that you had in trying to bring together the different identities? Like, if you were in an LGBTQ space, what were the identities that were left out that you had to bring in? If you were in an Asian space, what were the identities that you had to bring in to really expand that space?
I think it was more black and white in those days than it is now. It is wonderful that we have intersectionality now, where people understand they have many levels of their personality and many parts of their humanness, their humanhood. But back in the day when the disdain and the hate was so strong against LGBT people, that had to come first. That had to come first. And I probably was, if I had to list myself Asian, LGBT woman, LGBT had to come first, because that was the one that was lacking, because other women were rallying to the women's cause. That was a large population, and Asian Pacific community had a lot of folks advocating on that, but not many people were advocating for LGBT. So I had to choose my fights and put it there.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, like, you grew up during some really, really big movements that we, of course, are still continuing and are still drawing from, are still building on, you know, the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, and I mean, just so many movements, right? And I think, I imagine, especially growing up in LA, there was just a lot of passion and fierceness that happened in LA and that you were able to be a part of and you witnessed. Are there any moments that stand out to you, and you know, what kind of solidarity work you witnessed that you would like to tell folks that we can maybe draw from today during this uprising that's happening right now?
I have two feelings about the civil protests that are going on now. One is, which is obvious to everyone, it is so amazing to see the crowds as mixed and as multi-generational as they are now. No one saw that coming. I never saw that coming. And even I think the African American community is amazed by it. Their leadership keeps talking about it on the news, that, you know, families and young people and old people and children, and I think it's going to take years of sociological study to analyze and take apart how it is that that's happening now. Maybe the marriage equality movement maybe laid the groundwork for that, because when the energy moved in 2008 and people started, the force came out, the groundswell that came out to help people. I think it's because gay people came out at work, they came out at the bakery, they came out in the child care center, and everybody started to realize, I know a gay person, and it is not fair what's happening to them. So my point is that the quickness by which marriage equality turned around, I think it laid the groundwork for what we see today for the civil protests, that you don't have to be African American to understand that police brutality matters to everybody, that equal justice and equal opportunity matters for everybody. And I think people are getting it now. It's just an amazing phenomenon that it is as widespread and universal as it is now. So, and I also am so glad to have seen in the last few years, there used to be a very big gap between the African American community and the LGBT, that they could never meet, that young African American youth were not getting the support from their pastors, from their leadership. But that is really changing now. When you see African American leaders, it used to be they would say, you know, we are like the Hispanic movement, we are like the Asian American movement, but now they say we are like the LGBT movement, and they are understanding that the fight of LGBT people and the fight of African American people and all minorities is not that uncommon. So anyway, that's my own observation.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. And I'm thinking about a lot of things, but so in all of the movement spaces that you've been in, what do you think, what is something you would like to highlight or lift up or reflect on that you think is sort of a particular, either a struggle or a challenge that exists within the Japanese American, Japanese LGBTQ community, or it can be a significant movement forward that you've seen within the community?
Japanese American community today is nowhere close to what it was when I was in my 20s. And that's why I have so much respect for who I called one of my heroes, Tak Yamamoto. He crossed that divide by being a member of APLG, Asian Pacific Lesbians and Gays, and JACL of San Fernando Valley, and the Manzanar Committee. He generously and fearlessly brought his wholeness, his whole humanness to each of those things. And I think we can learn a lesson from that, that I am so proud of the young people that are doing their activist work equally in LGBT community and the Japanese American community, that one doesn't have to be divided from the other. But it was not possible in my younger years, and it was a lot of hard work and a lot of social change since that time. But like I said, I think people get it now, and there's a holistic feeling that to be a whole person, discrimination of any kind is bad. So I think the Japanese community has benefited a great deal from all other people's struggles, and I think it's made them more advanced and more wise and more knowledgeable. So I have nothing but great hope for the community as it goes forward into the future.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, I have clearly benefited from the work that you have done and the spaces that you've created, and I think when I'm doing my work now, I think what really anchors me is how I know the feeling. I know how powerful you can feel when you are in a space where you feel whole, right? And so coming back to that wholeness, and I think that is the right of every human being to have, to be able to access and to thrive in a community that makes you feel whole, and even like a space where you're able to discover that other parts of you existed. It's like, oh, I thought I was whole, but then look at this space. It's inviting me to even broaden like other aspects of you, right?
And that is the life journey, isn't it? Is that we may find more parts of ourselves that need to be sewn in that we didn't even know we were lacking. Maybe we find out we have a musicality, or we find we have an interest in some scholarly pursuit that we had no idea was coming. That's the wonderful life journey.
Yeah. I think this is going to be my last question because we have to wrap up. But if you could give one piece of wisdom, just like maybe 3 words to my generation and the younger generation, what would it be? It can be anything. Just 3 words of wisdom.
I'm going to use 4.
Okay.
Put your oar in. Put your oar in. Make that ripple. Be part of the team. Push forward. Push that envelope so that people can look back at your work and say, she was part of something wonderful. But you don't get there if you don't put your oar in. So that's what I would advise you, is however you do it, however little or great, whatever venue you decide to do it, it doesn't have to be LGBT, it doesn't have to be Japanese American, it could be anything that contributes to our larger humanity. Just put your oar in. Don't stand on the sidelines. And I want to say God bless you, because I think I have the greatest faith in you and your generation. And I'm so proud to have known you. And I know you're going to do wonderful things.
Thank you, June.
George Takei, who is an actor, an activist, and most recently the author of this graphic novel, They Call This Enemy. And George will be talking with Justin Kawaguchi, who is a rising senior at USC studying global health and also beginning a master's in health administration program this fall. So we're going to preface George and Justin's conversation with a short film that Barney Chang directed.
When I was about 9 or 10, and then this was in grammar school, I was starting to realize that I'm different in ways other than just my Japanese face. The other boys were saying things like, Sally's cute. I thought, Sally was nice, but Bobby, he was exciting. I just knew that I was excited by boys, and the other guys were excited by girls. But I thought that just made me feel different. And I must say, it made me feel a little lonely too, because I was the only one that felt that way, that I was hiding and keeping in. My heartthrob in high school was Tab Hunter. He was a blonde, heart-stoppingly handsome movie star. Every movie coming from Warner Brothers Studio starred Tab Hunter. One day, Confidential magazines exposed Tab Hunter as gay. Then, all the pictures from Warner Brothers didn't star Tab Hunter as they did. He just disappeared. Oh, it's not good to be gay. And I wanted to be an actor. And even when you're a big star, when people discover that you're gay, then you can't, they won't hire you. And so when I started my acting career, I tried to be as straight and as masculine as I possibly could be. And that's how the context of society was different in my days. Today, now, young people grow up knowing that the teacher, Mr. Jones, is gay, or college professor, Dr. Morrison, a lady, has a wife. In those days, I didn't know the meaning of the word gay. If I knew what I know now, I wouldn't have behaved in the way I did. I like to deal with the reality that I dealt with then, because that shaped me and made me who I am. It's important to deal with the reality that you're faced with, and how you deal with that will form you and define who you will become. And I'm who I am today because of all of the challenges I had, all of the setbacks I've had, all of the struggles that I have had to go over, and that shaped the real me today.
I think I kind of would love to begin our conversation by learning some more about your experience growing up gay in the Japanese American community and how that experience kind of shaped your life from that point.
Well, I think I'm the oldest of all the people participating in this program. I'm 83 now, and I've been shaped by another experience of major historic proportions before I made any discoveries about myself, and that was the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Overnight, we were looked at with suspicion and fear and outright hatred. And at 5 years old, I was classified as an enemy alien, which was crazy. It was irrational. I wasn't an enemy. I was a 5-year-old kid, and I wasn't an alien. I was born right here in Los Angeles, California, an American. My mother was born in Sacramento. She was an American. My father was born in Japan, but my paternal grandfather decided to immigrate when he was a little boy, and they moved to San Francisco. And so my father was reared and educated and spiritually felt very much San Franciscan. He called himself a San Franciscan. But we became overnight enemy aliens in our own country. And we were like all Japanese Americans throughout the country. But on February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed an executive order in which he ordered all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, 120,000 of us, to be summarily rounded up and imprisoned in barbed wire prison camps with no charges, no trial. The central pillar of our justice system just disappeared. And I have memories of that experience. I remember the barbed wire fence. I remember the sentry towers. I remember the searchlight that followed me. And as I was growing, and after the war, I remember how my parents struggled to get back on our feet. Because when the war ended and we were freed, they were stripped of everything. Japanese Americans had nothing, only a one-way ticket to anywhere in the country that we wanted to go to, and $25 to start life anew on $25. We came back to Los Angeles, and our first home was on Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles. And for us kids, and I was the oldest, my brother was a year younger, and my baby sister was an infant when we went into the camps. And so all she knew was the prison camp. But for us, the coming home, as my parents said, was the worst part of the internment. Skid Row was a horrifying hellhole. My baby sister said, "Mama, let's go back home," meaning behind barbed wire fences, because for her whole life was behind barbed wire fence. It was, at least it was regimented and orderly when there wasn't a riot, but it was something that we got accustomed to because children are amazingly adaptable. And Skid Row was a horrific place. And then we saw, how our parents struggled to get back on their feet. Long, killing hours at many different jobs and many different places. After Skid Row, we moved to East LA, all Mexican-American neighborhood, which had, another traumatic effect, but not as traumatic as Skid Row. From an all Japanese-American neighborhood behind barbed wire to Skid Row, and then an all Mexican-American neighborhood. And that was perhaps the most welcoming place for us. I had Mexican-American friends, and I loved walking home from school. They'd invite me to have after-school snack at their mamacita's kitchen. And you walked into that kitchen, and that wonderful warm aroma of fresh tortilla having been made in that kitchen. And she would put a little frijoles on it and roll it up, and that was our snack. It was wonderful. And then sometimes I invited them over to have an after-school snack at my place, and have my mother make something for them. And what it was white Wonder Bread with sugar on it. The burrito, a bean burrito, was a much more healthy snack than what my mother gave us. But it was that experience of being different, looking different like this, and being imprisoned and having that horrific experience, not only within the barbed wire fence, but also the Skid Row experience was a formative experience. Growing up in East LA was another one. And then in 5 years, my parents got enough money to buy a three-bedroom, two-bath home in the Wilshire district. And we got back on our feet. And so I had many different forces that shaped who I am. And when I became a teenager, my biggest curiosity was to learn more about our imprisonment. And I read history books, every history book I could come across. I became a voracious reader. I found nothing in the history books of that time on the internment. I read civics books, and I read about the ideals of American democracy, and I couldn't reconcile the two. And so I had many, many after-dinner conversations with my father. And I realize now, at that time I didn't. I gave my father a rough time. You know, I said, why did you take us into the barbed wire fence? Why didn't you resist? I would have, I said, Daddy, I would have protested. I would organize my friends at school and go downtown to the federal building and protest. And my father said, yes, I can imagine you doing something like that. But you got to remember, I had to think of your mother. I had to think of you, your brother, and your sister. They were pointing guns at me. If something happened to me, what do you think would happen to you guys? And so I understood that part, but I kept challenging my father. And he said, I mean, I learned about American democracy from the man in our family who suffered the most, who felt the anguish and the rage of the internment the most. He said, our democracy is a people's democracy. When he pledged allegiance to the flag, it ended with liberty and justice for all. This government likes to think it's ruled by law, a nation ruled by law. Those are great ideals. Abraham Lincoln said, of the people, by the people, for the people. But it's a people's government, and the people can do great things as they've done. But people are also fallible human beings, and they make mistakes. President Roosevelt was a great president in the 30s when we were in a under the crushing weight of that depression. And because of his problem-solving savvy, political savvy, and the power of the presidency, he was able to create jobs, build roads, bridges, post offices, and he brought the nation up. But he too was a human being. When the country was swept up with war hysteria, every politician, elected official, from city councils to state legislatures to the Congress. In fact, there was a Tennessee senator back then, a senator named Tom Stewart, who made the statement on the US Senate floor that any Japanese in this country would stab you in the back. What an outrageous statement. First of all, how many Japanese would a Tennessee senator know? But he said they're all stab you in the back. I mean, that's the kind of climate that was raging at that time. And President Roosevelt got swept up, and he signed Executive Order 9066. He said he was a human being, but he was a great president. And great presidents, when they make mistakes, make great mistakes. And for that, 120,000 they weren't all Americans, some were immigrants, but got severely punished. And so I started to understand something about our government. And my father said, I kept challenging my father. And one Sunday afternoon, he said, I'll show you how our government has to work. It's dependent on people who cherish those high ideals of American democracy and actively participate in the process. And he drove me downtown to the Adlai Stevenson for President campaign headquarters. And he liked to say, we volunteered, but I just tagged along. He volunteered me, but I learned about how it has to work. There I was with all these other people passionately dedicated to getting this great governor of Illinois elected president of the United States. And so almost every day after school, sometimes I took the bus and went downtown, and I volunteered. I stuffed envelopes, made phone calls, leafleted on the sidewalk. And having that understanding, I became active in other political campaigns. And my father also encouraged me to be active in student government, and I got elected student body president. So I became an activist, and then understanding social injustice, I became active in the civil rights movement. And because I was an actor, I got cast in a civil rights musical called Fly Blackbird, which became a big hit in in Los Angeles. And we were invited to sing at almost every civil rights rally in LA County. And at one of them, we had as our keynote speaker, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it was at the sports arena downtown. And we marched in with Dr. King, and we sang our hearts out. His speech was thrilling, absolutely transporting. And the biggest thrill of that day was we got invited to meet Dr. King himself down in his dressing room below the grandstand. And we got a chance to shake his hand and chat briefly. And he said to me, "Thank you very much for your participation." He said, particularly, it was good to see an Asian American involved in this movement. He said, there are very few Asian Americans involved in the civil rights movement. And those were precious words for me. From the time I was about 10 years old, I had the growing realization that I'm different in ways other than just my Japanese face. The other boys would say things like, Monica's hot. This was in junior high school. She was prematurely blossoming forth, and they were getting really crazy. Oh, wow, look at Monica, I thought Monica was nice. But as I said in that little film clip, there was a guy named Bobby Corral, who I thought was so cute. I mean, my heart went pitter-pat when Bobby was anywhere around, and he was so nice, and that sweet smile that he had. And I noticed that the other boys weren't feeling the same way. I was the only one. And it was kind of a lonely feeling. And I didn't know why I was different. I mean, I was different like this, and we were imprisoned. Why am I different in a different way? And as I grew up, these other boys would find a sissy boy, when he walked with his book, he carried it on his chest, and when he walked, it was mincing, and they would tease him, call him names, and laugh at him. And I didn't really want to be anything like that. I didn't want to be teased. So I started pretending like I was one of them. And I didn't tease the sissy boys. In fact, I made friends with some of them. But I wanted to be as normal, in quotes, as possible. And when they started dating, I started dating girls too. I went to the prom and with a Japanese American girl. And when my buddy wanted to double date, I double dated. But I was more interested in my buddy than in my date. And then when I started pursuing an acting career, that Tab Hunter story, when Tab Hunter, he was a big box office star, but when he was exposed as being gay, they dropped him. I knew it was foolish for me to pursue an acting career when I am who I am, and why should I come out and expose that? So I kept playing that double life, feeling the way I kept my feelings in and suppressed, and living a second life as one of the guys. I realized that when I was a child, I was behind very real barbed wire fences. But as I was growing up, I was imprisoned behind an invisible barbed wire fence that still had
the hard, sharp barbs of prejudice and hate. And I kept myself imprisoned there. And so, as active as I was as an activist throughout, I was closeted. And that double life is a torturous thing because the gay issue was very personal to me. I was there actively advocating for, equality for African Americans and peace in Vietnam and redress and reparations for our imprisonment. And yet that issue that's closest to me, I wasn't speaking up. And the guilt, it wasn't just the sense of protecting my career, which was a critical reason for my remaining behind those invisible barbed wire fences. But the other torture was the guilt, the constant guilt. And as my career gained some momentum, there's always that fear of suddenly being exposed. There's that needle prick anxiety all the time, every day, throughout the day. Who's going to expose me? Who's going to ruin my career? And so it was a torturous life. And I lived that life for most of my adult life. I discovered gay bars. And there, at last, I felt like I could put my guard down and really be who I am and talk with other guys about that movie where Tab Hunter took his shirt off, and they felt the same way I did. So the gay bar became an oasis for me. But one of the older guys told me that even in a gay bar, you had to be cautious because the police raided it, and they would take you down to the police station and photograph you, fingerprint you, and put your name on a list. If any of that got exposed, it would be devastating. And so even in gay bars, from that point on, I always found the exit to the back door and hung out close to that. So most of my adult life was lived like that. I met Brad back in the early 80s, and we got together. We've been together for 34 years now. So we've been really living a double life and fearful of exposure. But the people that were out there in the gay liberation movement were making an impact, and things were starting to happen.
I think that speaking for myself, and I think many other young Japanese Americans, I think hearing the way that you have been so active as a torchbearer for equality and I think advocacy is really quite inspiring. And I think speaking for myself and that knowing my family's history in the incarceration camps during World War II has I think really left this hole where I want to learn more about the history and more about what it was like back then for them, and to hear how you have been able to, I think, maybe take that experience feeling othered for not only your face, but also who you were inside, and then turn that into a platform to advocate for others and really champion equality is I think what so many of us now are looking to, how can we make a similar impact? And I think that what's really inspiring about what you do and the way that you can really craft these wonderful stories and help us understand what life was like back in World War II and then afterwards as well. And so I think a question that I have for you now, maybe speaking to maybe the youth members who are near my age, either college or a little bit afterwards, or even earlier as well, is that do you have any advice on ways that we can, what should we do? Should we learn the history? How can we be advocates? How can we use our voices and our platforms to make change? Do you have any advice for the youth who may be watching this panel?
The same question that Aya asked. And so I was thinking on that. And as an actor, I immediately think of a Shakespearean quote. Shakespeare said, "To thine own self be true, know who you are." But I would add another word, courage. You've got to have the courage to be who you are. Know who you are. And that most people really don't know who they are. They don't have that
self-examination. And when you get to know who you are, you realize that you're shaped by all the forces in your life, which means your history. And your grandfather played a part in forming me too, because after the war, I went to Senshin Buddhist Temple for a Sunday school. And my Sunday school teacher was Tsukasa Saneto, your grandfather, who you told me passed when you were 1 year old. So you really didn't get to know what an amazing man he was. He first of all, he was linguistically impressive. He spoke Japanese like a person from Japan, with all of the gestures and the niceties of the language. But then he could turn around and speak just like us. I mean, he was a Nisei and very eloquent in English and Japanese. And he was a very good teacher. He knew how to communicate some of the Buddhist ideas to people. And I learned about Buddhism from your grandfather. And as when we got marriage equality in California in 2008, Brad and I decided we're going to get married in the Democracy Forum, Tateuchi Democracy Forum of the Japanese American National Museum, because it was democracy that made our wedding possible.
Right. I think that's so wonderful to hear. I think the way that you've been able to, champion diversity. I mean, going back to what you were saying before about how my grandfather was able to balance both, speaking Japanese and English so eloquently. I think that similarly today, so many of us balance having to, have different parts of our identities, being whether you're in school. For me, it's like if I'm being part of the queer community, but also being Japanese American and being a Trojan. It's like go to school at USC and all the different parts of yourselves. And I think like Aya was saying before, I think finding a community where you can really unpack those different parts of yourself and find ways to talk about it and find camaraderie. For me, I think joining the Okaeri committee and the Okaeri community this past year has been a really, eye-opening experience for me. And I'm really grateful to have found spaces like you have found where you can champion, have friends who are different backgrounds, such diversity. So I'm really grateful to have had that experience myself.
For you. The first one is to Aya, and it's from Greg. And he's curious about what led your family to immigrate to the US. So that's question number one. And question number two is, what has been your perception of new Japanese or newer Japanese immigrants towards LGBTQ folks?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Greg. Nice to meet you virtually. So my whole family still lives in Japan. I moved back and forth since I was young. So my father, I guess, had a job where he works for a corporation, and he was sent to the States for just a limited amount of time. So we lived in the north suburbs of Chicago from when I was 5 to 9 years old, moved back to Tokyo, where I spent until the junior year of high school. And then junior year of high school, my father again got transferred to the same area, north suburb of Chicago, where we lived as a family for just 2 years. And when I started undergrad, which was in 2004, my family moved back to Japan for good. So my parents have, and I'm the only child, so it's just my parents and I, but my parents have never, I don't think, have ever identified as anything but Japanese. I don't think they've identified even as immigrants because their experience was so time-bound from the beginning. And so when I identify myself as bicultural, I say that from a place where I have native fluency in speaking, writing, and reading Japanese. That was my first language. That's the language that I first learned to think in and to express myself in. And that is the only language that I communicate with my parents and all of my other family in Japan. But my higher education and all of my politicizing, all of my work and also building of my queer identity happened in English and in the context of the US, right? And so I think I've said this before in some other spaces, but for me, I think the lifelong journey will always be, what does it mean to feel like I am not two completely separate people? Because when I speak and think in Japanese, I feel like I am transported back to a teenager, and my identity almost seems stuck there. And so there is a magic for me when I'm able to talk to my parents about this event. For example, I am forced to talk about LGBTQ issues and also my identity in Japanese. And that's just like a whole different experience for me. It's almost like I guess, discovering or allowing my young self to grow up to be where I am now as an English speaking queer person that lives in the US. So that's my story. And I wouldn't really be able to tell you what the new sort of immigrant population, the Japanese immigrant population, thinks about LGBTQ issues. But I will say that there is a lot of really powerful organizing happening in Japan, and I think hopefully in the Okaeri offerings that we're able to offer everybody virtually in a few months, will incorporate a lot of what organizing looks like in Japan, because it's very, very different, right? Like coming out to your family isn't the only way to be courageous, for example. A lot of folks choose not to come out, and they do it with a feeling, they're at peace with it. They just say, this is just not the time. That is not my battle. I'm going to live my LGBTQ life elsewhere, and I will maintain a great relationship with my parents, but that is just not something I'm going to talk about. But that doesn't mean they're not organizing or trying to really change the culture elsewhere in Japan. So hopefully we'll be able to have more of these conversations and offer something for all of you at the Okaeri event.
June, there's a question for you from Drew. He's curious what motivated your activism, especially in the early years when it was much harder to fight for LGBTQ equality.
I saw that question from Drew, and I answered him privately, but I have no problem articulating it publicly. It's because I've always had the inclination to jump off cliffs. Just, like the what the hell. I think it's because growing up bicultural, because I'm a quarter Filipino, a quarter Anglo, and half Japanese, and then growing up in a Hispanic neighborhood, and then having the power of all the civil rights and Stonewall and Hispanic community coming up behind me, that engine, it made it easier to leap forward. So just not caring so much what people were going to say, and I think I kind of like getting a rise out of people anyway. I'm just naughty that way. Sorry.
Well, we're benefiting from your naughtiness, June, so thank you for being an early leader. Have you experienced tension between your Japanese American Nikkei identity when you've been involved in LGBTQ activism, and Lisa cited that saying that George did about the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. So Justin, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I've been really fortunate to, understand is, as George mentioned during our conversation, how I think the Japanese American community has such a rich history, of social justice, from the movement for redress and reparation. I think my mother was super involved with that movement as well. I think that culture within the J community has, led them to become, very much more accepting. And I think being Buddhist as well and growing up in that community, I think that people see that differences don't always have to be something that's bad, and it can be celebrated. I think there's still lots of work to be done to, champion equality and acceptance in all communities. But for myself personally, I've been really grateful to have been part of the Japanese American community, and being part of Okaeri specifically, and meeting people who come from similar backgrounds, similar values, has really given me a sense of community. And so for myself personally, I really think that being Japanese American has been an inclusive and very loving environment to be queer within.
And George, how about your experience?
Well, as I said, I've been an activist behind these invisible barbed wire fence through most of my adult life, and I've been active in the Japanese American community. I'm one of the founders of the Japanese American National Museum, chairman emeritus, and I'm on the board of trustees there. And what was the point that the question was what?
About if you felt tension between your Japanese American
yes.
identity?
When we had the exhibit openings, we'd have exhibit opening festivities and drinks and hors d'oeuvres and all. And I'd bring Brad with me. And so the other people at the museum knew that Brad was my friend. And it was awkward when a fellow member of the board wanted to introduce me to somebody else, and Brad was there. They would say, George's friend, and introduce Brad. But after we got married at the museum, and we did invite a lot of the people from the museum to our wedding, I was very curious as to how they would accept me as now an out gay person, and how they would accept Brad. And it was magical. They knew already, but they felt awkward talking about it with us. And so once we got married and it was out, then they were completely comfortable. So people are more open to accepting LGBT people now, at least in 2008. I was pleasantly surprised.
Many people in evangelical churches are concerned about the Supreme Court decision that George referenced earlier, which applies to LGBTQ people, the Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people can't be fired just because of their sexual identity or their gender identity. So Grace is wondering if there's space for evangelical Christians who still hold their beliefs that homosexuality is wrong, or are those beliefs continuing to be barriers that need to come down? So it's a pretty heavy duty question. We don't have a whole lot of time. So I don't know, June, you want to start, and then we can pass the baton.
Yeah, they got to get over it. I'm sorry. They got to get over it. It's like saying a church can't let Black people in or Hispanic people in. That's the whole point of intersectionality, right? Is equal is equal. So no, I don't buy the argument that, that's our spiritual belief, and that therefore that gives us the excuse to exclude. Those days are gone, on the way out, and they just got to get over it. That's it.
Aya, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, thank you for that, June. I will ditto that. And I have to say, I don't come from a religious background, so there are experiences and complexities that I cannot speak to. But I think for this particular Supreme Court decision, for me, I'm just like, my concern is I want us to be fighting for every trans person, every non-binary person, every queer person to actually even get a job. Like, there are so many people that can't even get a job. They're not even at a point where they're even considering using this law to sue their employer for being fired. So I'm just kind of like, all right, well, I just want to be fighting for a place, for a world where people who are working informal economies, those jobs are protected. They're not criminalized. That, you know, if somebody applies for a job, they're able to get a fair chance at it, right? And then and then so maybe then we'll get to a point where it's like, okay, you don't want to hire this person, that's your loss. This person has so many other opportunities for employment. So, you know, it's just like, well, you're missing out as a church perhaps that's holding these beliefs. So that's really where my mind's at, and I'm just ready to fight that.
We just have a couple of minutes left. Justin, you want to?
I would just also ditto what Aya and June said. I just really hope that I think young people will take up the torch. I think to continue to advocate for more equality and more equal rights for everybody. But I would really just, June and Aya, you said it perfectly, so eloquently. So I would just ditto that as well. Thank you.
And George, you have the last word before we pass it back to George.
Buddhism has no problem with it. Buddhism believes in the oneness of the whole. We're all part of it. I think Christianity has that problem, but they believe in compassion and brotherhood of man. And I think we have to argue on their values. What is their church belief at the core. It isn't hate. It isn't discrimination. It's compassion. And I think they too will come about. I don't think going aggressively and making them feel that they are terrible is the way to convince them. You have to see it from their perspective and use their values and turn it around to them.
I agree.
Thank you, George. Thank you, everybody.